So welcome to today's edition of The World Today, which explores the refugee crisis in Europe. In the summer of 2015, as many of you know, the European migration crisis dominated headlines around the world. Over 1 million people, including refugees fleeing the devastating civil war in Syria, crossed the Mediterranean Sea and arrived in Europe seeking asylum. In 2015, a record 1.5 million people sought asylum in Europe. Recently, with Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, over 4.6 million people left Ukraine, many of whom flooded into bordering European countries. Exposing severe weaknesses in the EU asylum system, the 2015 crisis unleashed profound upheaval, causing serious divisions within the European Union and a resurgence of anti-migrant rhetoric across the continent. Today, the picture remains bleak for many who risk everything to reach Europe each year. To guide us through this critical discussion and help us to better understand today's landscape and what the possibilities are for policy, societal, and other reforms, I'd like briefly to introduce our three distinguished panelists. Their longer bios, as you all know, are online and you can read them and be really impressed. And so what I'm going to do is to share something very short. To my left is Elizabeth Casinas, who has more than 25 years of experience in conflict resolution and international development, with a particular interest in issues of migration. She is currently executive manager of Caritas Cyprus, a grassroots humanitarian organization that supports vulnerable populations, including migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. Previously, she served in various positions within USAID in Cyprus, where she was responsible for over $100 million in programming. To her left, Guy Grossman is a professor of political science at Penn. His research is in applied political economy with substantive focus on the intersection of technology and governance, political accountability, forced migration, conflict processes, and a regional focus on sub-Saharan Africa and Israel-Palestine. Published in leading peer-reviewed journals, Grossman is the founder and co-director of Penn's Development Research Initiative and a faculty affiliate of groups including Stanford's Immigration Policy Lab and Penn's Center for the Study of Ethnicity, Race, and Immigration. To his left, Nicholas Sabanas is the Presidential Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Director of the Penn Program on Identity and Conflict here at Penn. He writes on intergroup conflict, ranging from everyday forms of discrimination to violent protests and civil wars. His articles on civil war, peacekeeping, and ethnic conflict have been published in leading peer-reviewed journals. Currently, he is working on several projects focused on anti-immigration bias and discrimination in Europe. His book, Native Bias, Overcoming Discrimination Against Immigrants, was just published. And with that, we thought we'd open by having maybe 2 or 3 minutes of opening remarks from each panelist who brings a very different kind of both perspective and entry point into what is both a regional and a global crisis all at once. And we'll start with Elizabeth.
Thank you. Is this right? Okay. Thank you, LaShawn. And thank you to the Perry World House for organizing what will be, I'm sure, a very interesting discussion today. So there are about 100 million people in the world that have been forcibly displaced. 10 million of them were compelled to undertake their journey just last year because of, as LaShawn said, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because of ongoing and unresolved conflicts in Syria and Afghanistan, and because of political turmoil and violence in places as far and different as Venezuela and Myanmar and South Sudan. Half of the 100 million are actually internally displaced, so they're within their country of origin, and most of them will stay within the global south. But of course, that said, no country or continent is immune, and Europe remains a country, a destination, a preferred destination, and it continues to receive hundreds of thousands of people, even since the peak of the crisis that began in 2015 with the Syrian movements. And this really, I think this upheaval, forgive me, my hands, my notes, has profound implications for the countries, for Europe generally, as well as for European countries and the politics and their societies. So within European countries that are also facing obviously different economic circumstances, there is anti-migrant sentiment, there's racism, We've brought to the fore a lot of far-right platforms and leaders who espouse this exclusionist and isolationist policies. For those who make it into European countries, the circumstances are far less welcoming. The conditions are very difficult. There's little support for transition and very few prospects for any meaningful integration in some cases. For those that are unlucky enough to be caught in limbo at the borders, there's often deplorable conditions that have become very almost normal, which exacerbates the trauma that they've been through and leaves them open to further exploitation. Interestingly also is the strain that it's putting on relationship between European countries. Europe is struggling now to maintain this sort of solidarity or the openness and commitment to valuing the multiculturalism that underlines or underpins the European experiment. And they're searching for a way to burden share between the frontline states that are receiving the largest number of arrivals and those who aren't. And of course, sort of trying to find the right mix and opinions between those who are more open in welcoming and those who are not. The other thing, of course, that these movements of people have resulted in is changes in the way that Europe relates to the outside world. So there's something of a redefining of the term fortress Europe as we know it. And just because Europe has a migration policy isn't stopping people from migrating. In fact, it's just making it harder for them to do that. And they stay on the move. In 2015, it was estimated that for every 50 people who tried to make the perilous journey to Europe, one of them would lose, there would be one life lost. It's estimated that now it's well below 20, 1 in 20. And Europe is increasingly finding ways to sort of push out its borders and sort of militarize its outer rim. It's outsourcing border control to the coast guards of places like Libya and Lebanon, and compromising human rights, including that of the right to seek asylum along the way. There are interceptions, pushbacks, and then of course Europe is receiving a lot of criticism for inhumane treatment as it sort of strengthens its external border management. The last point I think that's important and relevant to the sort of the larger context is that with these dramatic movements of people are coming reasons and flashpoints for Europe and its neighbors to have problems. Turkey hosts the largest number of refugees, for example, in the world, and it's right there. And as a neighbor, it has shown an ability and a willingness and a possible to raise tensions or create conflict using people, desperate people, as a means for doing so. Last year, Belarus instrumentalized sort of desperate people on the border with Poland and Lithuania. And then going again back to the case of Turkey, we have the weaponization of people and introducing complicated tensions to places, to the borders with Greece, and of course then with unfettered access to the Republic of Cyprus, which is receiving the largest number of refugees right now, asylum seekers per capita. So with that, I will turn to the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth Guy.
Great, thanks. First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and thanks you for coming. I'm going to spend the next 2-3 minutes with a set of facts that will help kind of structure the conversation, the kind of moderated discussion and the Q&A. The first fact that I think is important to keep in mind is that 85% of refugees reside in the global south. So they reside or are hosted in countries that are considered developing countries. And the reason we have we have that number is because 90% or north of 90% of refugees live in a country that is a neighboring country that has a border with their host country, right? And so, we tend to talk a lot about the refugee crisis through the lens of Europe, but when we are thinking about the refugee situation, we have to consider the fact that the large number of people is not necessarily heading to Europe, not necessarily wanting to head to Europe, right? There's multiple reasons for that. We can talk about them in the Q&A, but I want us to keep in mind the number that 90% of refugees are in neighboring countries. So that's really important. One of the main reasons why people are in a neighboring country is because they hope to get home quick when the conditions improve. Most people don't want to get to Europe. Most people are pretty happy living where they are. They like the landscape where they grow up. They like the food. They have family ties. Just like in the United States, not everyone leaves to places where they can make more money. Right? Even though borders between states are open in the United States, most people end up living. 75% of the Americans will end up living something like 10 miles away from where they grew up. Most people have a strong bias to where they grew up. That's not just Americans, that's everywhere in the world, right? But even though most people want to go back home when the conditions improve, that's not always the case. And another number that I want you to keep in mind, which is 78% of refugees are in what we call a protracted displacement. What is protracted displacement? It's defined as living more than 5 years out of your country. The average refugee will be, the spell of displacement is 26 years. Okay? Why is that important? That's important because when we have such protracted displacement, then the question of how we integrate refugees into the host society becomes obviously paramount. And so we need to talk a bit about that. How did we get to a stage where the average refugee stays is 26 years in exile and 78% are in protracted situation? Well, the reason is when we think about the kind of what UNHCR and IOM and talk about the durable solutions for refugees. So the three what we call durable solution. One is resettlement in the global north. Usually when that happens, there's no more movement. The second one, which is getting citizenship in the host country. And the third one is going back home. Less than 2% of refugees can realize any of these. Okay, so I'll give you another number that I want to stay with you. What is the share of refugees, of the stock of refugees in the world that get resettled in the global north in a given year? 0.61%. Okay, less than 1%, only 0.61% of refugees get resettled. What is the share of refugees, stock of refugees in a given year that are granted citizenship in the country of asylum? Less than 1%. And so in a world in which those durable solutions are not really solution, integration into the community becomes, as I said, paramount. The third thing that I want to say before I pass things to Nicholas is when we think about the integration of refugees in these neighboring countries, the vast majority of people that never start even the journey to Europe, we find really large variation in the policy that governs the hosting of refugee and asylum seekers, okay? So if you think about the policy space, and when we talk about the policy space, we can talk about things like access to services, we can think about path to citizenship and political participation, we can think about things related to livelihood, so right to work, to own land, to rent and start a business. When we think about kind of these domains, we find really large variation in the policy space of different countries. I have a lot of research that documents that, but even more interesting, these policies matter a lot for the successful integration. Why is that relevant if we're thinking about the European crisis? Because the more successful the integration of refugees are in the neighboring countries where they reside, the less likely we'll see these pressures on the EU. And there's a lot of very important lesson to learn about how to do refugee integration successfully, and a lot of lesson of how you do it unsuccessfully. So I hope I'll have an opportunity to talk a bit about Uganda as a case study. We'll leave that to later, but I'll just leave you with this idea that integration policies matter, and there's a lot of variation in how countries implement these policies.
Great, thank you. Nicholas?
Thank you. That was more than 2 minutes. So I will try to keep it to 2 minutes. So I'll pick up the thread from Guy. The challenge of integration that Guy mentioned brings up one question in particular. well, anywhere, but that question has been brought up a lot in the context of European politics, and that's multiculturalism, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether it has failed or not. Because most of the refugee or immigrant populations that need to be integrated are usually culturally different from the native people, and that creates conflict. So this is an interesting discussion. It's an old discussion, and it has both normative and positivist implications. So the normative is, what should we do as natives or people welcoming newcomers to our country? And the positive dimension is what is likely to happen when you have influx of newcomers, right? And my work deals with the second type of issue, the positivist, not the normative stuff, right? So I won't speak about what should happen, but I can tell you a little bit about what has happened and address some of the questions that Guy raised and that LaShawn mentioned, but particularly with a focus on how bias against refugee and immigrant populations might be achieved. What I have to say is not specific to refugees. It applies to immigrants in general. And that's because the main reason that refugee populations face hurdles in integration is that they're culturally distant from the native population, right? So this is a problem because human beings are biased towards people they think are different from them, right? So there's a innate human tendency towards parochialism and towards attachment to a group that people believe they belong to, and hostility perhaps towards groups that are outside of that narrow circle, right? That's a result that people have shown in psychology, economics, political science a gazillion times, So all you have to do to generate hostility towards our groups is create two groups, assign people to those groups, and then have them interact in some way. And pretty soon you can create conflict, between them. So when those groups have national histories, myths of belonging to a particular territory, resources that they have to split between themselves, then you can imagine that the potential for conflict is huge, right? And that's exactly what's happening basically in Europe and anywhere where you have new populations coming in, seeking access to resources that people think they haven't contributed to. And then all these debates ensue about who deserves assistance and who doesn't and so forth. So resource competition, the perception of cultural threat, combined with this innate tendency for in-group bias, basically creates a recipe for conflict. And that's because people make assumptions, like, so when they look at someone who looks different than them, people make assumptions that these people actually think differently from themselves, right? So in the research that I have done with several co-authors, in particular with Danny Choi at Brown and Matthias Portner at LSE, we show that these superficial physical attributes and differences, racial differences, religious differences, and so forth, or linguistic differences don't matter as much in the European context as the normative differences that people assume are behind these differences in superficial traits. So when native Europeans who are white Christians see Muslim immigrants or refugees in their countries, they assume that they believe different things about how life should be lived and how citizens should behave toward each other. And it's these differences and assumptions that people make about what is appropriate civic behavior and what citizenship means that drive a lot of this conflict, right? So the good news from our work, depending on your normative position on this issue, is that the hurdles to multiculturalism can be overcome, right? And the superficial differences between people, skin color, language, religion, and all that can be overcome. But the bad news is that they can only be overcome if there is some kind of adjustment, right? So if everybody somehow coordinates on a common set of norms and ideas that define good citizenship. And that can be achieved either by newcomers adapting to the natives' way of life, or natives adjusting their way of life to move closer to the newcomers, or having a mutual adjustment process, right? And I will leave it at that. I went over my 2 minutes too, I think. Yeah. And then we can discuss more in Q&A.
Perfect. And we will move to Q&A in about 8 minutes. But before that, I have a couple of questions of my own. And so I wanted to kind of pick up where Nicholas left off about this kind of idea that an overarching idea that there is a way to actually effectively, appropriately overcome bias against refugees and migrants. And I'm wondering, so I'm going to ask a question of kind of each of you. So Guy, for the work that you've done in Africa, where you've talked very explicitly in our pre-meeting to this, we were talking about like who acted as an example to whom. And Guy mentioned, and I'm giving him the opportunity to talk about how important it is for what's happening in a place like sub-Saharan Africa to be an example, perhaps to Europe, but also to other places within sub-Saharan Africa. And the example we were really talking about was the example that Uganda could offer to places like Kenya and Tanzania in terms of integration. Similarly, I wanted to ask Elizabeth then, in terms of what you're seeing in Cyprus, whether what Nicholas has just outlined in terms of overcoming bias and this issue that's been mentioned about kind of resource competition, how it manifests itself in what you've done on the ground to address it. And maybe we'll start then with Guy.
Yeah, so if you look at the research in the European context on what happens to host communities when refugees and migrants enter, the outcomes are, you know, as Nicholas said, we can overcome some biases, but on average, we're still seeing that you increase by 1% the share of refugees and migrants in a municipality, in the average European municipality. It increases the vote share for the far-right parties by 0.57 percentage point, right? That's kind of averaged across like something like 25 studies, right? So we're seeing that. And then the question is like, will we see the same thing when we move to different contexts? Uganda is an interesting context to kind of compare because it hosts a significantly larger number of refugees. So Europe, and it's all of like the migration crisis, you know, when we talk about the 2015, 2016, we were talking about something like 3 million refugees over something like, you know, 500 to 700 million, depends what countries you count in Europe. Uganda absorbed 1.3 million refugees for a country of 40 million, right? So we're talking about like huge, so A, we're talking about like much bigger magnitude. And second, we're talking about refugee policies that are significantly more inclusive and hospitable than what you'll find in the average African countries, but also the European countries. We're talking about like access to health services, to education. We're talking about like freedom of movement. We're talking about like right to work. We're talking about like right to start, to start a business, own and rent property, right to own land. So we're talking about quite an interesting situation where we have a lot of people coming into a domain, a policy domain that is extremely inclusive and liberal, right? And so you would expect that maybe you'll see a backlash from the local population, but we're not seeing that. Not only we're not seeing that, I was in Uganda 2 months ago. I go there a lot. I have a lot of research there. There's districts that are mobilizing against the government to demand that the government will open refugee hosting centers in the district, which you think, why is that the case? Well, the case is quite simple. The reason is that Uganda, in addition to the hospitable policies that they have towards refugees, have a very interesting mechanism to how to allocate humanitarian aid that comes to host refugees, okay? And the idea is that they have the 70-30 rule, so every $10 that comes to, to host refugees in aid has to be spent on, three of that has to be spent on the local population. And in addition, all the development and humanitarian aid that comes to host refugees has to be integrated into the government development policies. And so when you do that, we show in our research that there's like positive spillovers to the local population because schools that are being built and roads that are being paved and clinics that are being funded benefit the local population. So when you have this positive spillover to the local population, people are not unhappy, right? This is not necessarily something that like Poland should adopt or necessarily Germany should, because I think there's too many differences. We can talk about the differences, but clearly something that Kenya should adopt because, or they could consider adopting because Kenya, there's an encampment. You can't live outside camp. You can't you don't have a right to work. In Jordan, like Syrians don't have a right to work, right? And the idea is that we can, and these are lessons that are not only important to countries in the global south, but also important to the global north that funds so much of through these burden sharing agreements, that there's a way of funding the humanitarian aid, there's a way of funding the development aid that will reduce and not exacerbate conflict. And I think there's very important lesson to be learned here to policymakers, both in the global north and in the global south.
Yeah, not necessarily response, but yeah, a comment on this. So, I mean, it struck me that if the basis for reduction of conflict is these spillovers, then that experience doesn't apply to Europe because there are no such spillovers. They're only perceived costs, right? And then thinking about Lashon's question and what we can learn about Uganda's experience, for example, or sub-Saharan African experiences with refugees, it's very hard to extrapolate from that context to the European context. I believe every country in Europe, maybe with the exception of Bosnia, has a majority, ethnic majority population. I mean, there might be more than one, but most of them, the vast majority of them, have one group that's the vast majority of the population, right? So they're ethnically homogeneous. Whereas the norm for sub-Saharan African countries is to be multi-ethnic, not to have majority populations. So that is huge, right? So people basically grow up accepting cultural difference as a reality. And that also means that it's not the case that the laws and institutions of a country codify the values and beliefs of one particular group, right? So they have to be more open and more pluralistic, whereas in Europe, it's the opposite. So cultural difference is going to have a huge effect in Europe and a smaller effect in sub-Saharan Africa. The second big difference is that borders don't matter as much in sub-Saharan African countries by design, basically, right? So think about how many international wars have taken place in Africa, very few, whereas Europe, many, right? So it's easier to move back and forth between borders. People do it all the time. It's actually a way of diffusing domestic conflicts, right? In many instances, whereas that just doesn't happen in Europe, right? So the act of moving and just finding people from another country suddenly living in your area and accessing your public goods that the state provides is more normal in the African context than it is in the European context. And that is also reflected in rules governing citizenship and nationality, which are very different in many European countries, where you can't just become a citizen by living there or even by born in the country, right? Citizenship passes through blood, right? In Germany, for example, or in Greece, okay? So, your father or your mother or both have to have been nationals of the state. So the fact that many European countries have laws like this suggests that they perceive nationality and citizenship different than many countries in other parts of the world. And that is also a potential source of conflict and why it might be very difficult to extrapolate from one context to another.
I'll have Guy respond briefly, and then we'll move to Elizabeth.
Yeah, so I completely agree with Nicholas. Just to be very clear, the Ugandan model is not, or any African context is not something that is the model to Europe, because we're talking about a very, very different context, right? Like in the European context, hosting refugees comes usually from the national budget, right? And so there's questions about concern on the welfare state. Most employment is formal, so there's concern about a competition on low-skilled wage. I mean, just to be clear, that's not what I had in mind at all. The lesson for Europe that Uganda offers is about the importance of burden sharing in terms of cost and how to allocate the resources once they are shared with hosting countries. So we know that like to host refugees, it has to be even, it's not distributed evenly, right? Pakistan hosts a lot of like Afghans, and Uganda hosts a lot of South Sudanese, and Jordan and Lebanon with like 4.5 million is hosting 900,000 Syrians, right? That's just like insane, right? And so if the world wants, and when I say world, here's mostly Europe, wants Lebanon to continue hosting them, they have to share the burden. And there's good ways of sharing the burdens and bad ways of sharing the burden, right? And so the point that I'm making is less about changing the policies in Europe, because we're not going to change like Germans like citizenship, and we're not. There's also, by the way, there's multiple differences also in terms of how parties are organized, and so the point is mostly about the importance of burden sharing and how to allocate the resources in ways that will benefit the local population, such that accepting refugees that are kin and kith from the in your neighborhood is not doesn't like lead to greater hostility, doesn't like destabilize regimes, but actually is accepted by the population in ways that reduce not only the pressure in sub-Saharan Africa, but also reduces the pressure in Europe. I think there is a solution that, refugee is a crisis for all, but it could be managed better if there's a bit more coordination between the North and South.
Thank you. We're going to turn to Elizabeth, and then I have a follow-up question about the resource sharing and burden sharing.
Well, to come back to your point, I think Nicholas has made the point that transition and integration can be done successfully after a period of adjustment. And I think this is the critical piece, which is the resources. An adjustment takes resources and it takes time. And really, for some of the cases, for some of the countries, when you have the movements that you had in 2015 or the movements that we're seeing now, and Ukraine is no different, capacities get overwhelmed very, very quickly. So you're constantly in catch up. And migrants don't arrive, or waves don't arrive in a vacuum. And often they come with an economic downturn. They come, and if you can't offer people jobs and they can't actually, it's not just that they become a drain on the welfare system or on the social structures, but in the short term, someone has to maintain, there's an issue of the humanitarian aspect of that as well. So I think that it is possible adjustment. It's all in the adjustment, and we come back to resources to some degree.
So I want to follow up on this point about kind of resource allocation and burden sharing, and then we're going to move to audience questions, both online, and I've got a couple, and we'll start with in person. And again, there's a mic on stage or audience left. So, and maybe I'm asking you all to speculate a little bit. So we framed this discussion as a crisis because it's been perceived as a crisis, but certainly numerically, and certainly in terms of available resources, it's less of a crisis in Europe than it is actually in many other places. And Guy, you alluded to this already. Turkey hosts 3.8 million migrants. Colombia hosts 1.8 million. Pakistan hosts 1.5 million. Uganda hosts 1.3 or 5 million. Germany hosts 1.3 million. So I feel on one hand, like we frame this as a crisis because that's what's been happening. But on the other hand, this is a union of 27 countries now where there are resources, where it can be some, and the idea behind the European Union is that there would be burden sharing of some sort and kind of organized policy in terms of asylum and refugees. And I just wanted to get a sense then of, is that just in rhetoric? Is there not a crisis? Or if there is a crisis, is it more a crisis of kind of faith and a crisis of will than an actual fiscal FISCAL crisis? And that, again, I'm asking you all to speculate a bit because it's based on your opinion and hopefully some facts. And who would like to go first on that?
Well, it's interesting. I think it's a crisis. Yes, it's a crisis because it captivates headlines to some degree, right? And so I think the pictures from the Mediterranean and the idea that people are losing. Now, again, it's not that there's any less loss of life coming up from Latin America into the United States or even across Africa or in Asia. In terms of burden sharing, I think, again, the European Pact on Migration, this attempt that Europe is.
It's the 2020 agreement.
It is. And it puts a heavy emphasis on, I think what they call external border management, right? It's all in what is the burden sharing. And part of the architecture of the burden sharing is informed by how I feel, am I the German model where I'm willing to accept 1.5% of my population to be made up of refugees that I'm willing to accept and to support and to integrate? Or am I more Hungary? Am I Poland? Who am I in this? And then I think 2022 and 2023 will be very, very different because of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. That changes everything. I mean, the numbers are large. Right now, there is sort of a very open, they were able immediately to put up a capacity to absorb a tremendous amount. But as Guy was saying, this could quickly become a protracted, I know you said 5 years, but protracted after a year, right? That's the definition, but it's going to be a year or two. And we're talking about a lot of women and children in this case who have different needs, schooling. I know in the case of Cyprus, there's very little capacity to integrate that a large number of students who speak a completely different language. And then in some cases, the languages are not very close anyway. It's going to take them a long time. So,
Guy?
It's a tough question. I think for me, the crisis is not the numbers. The crisis is the response of Europe and the United States. And the crisis is mostly that I'm concerned about is the democratic erosion crisis and the norm erosion crisis, right? So the thing that I'm concerned about is, outsourcing asylum, the United States outsourcing asylum to Mexico, caging kids, separating kids from their families. That's the crisis for me. We're seeing now the UK signed an agreement with Rwanda where they process asylum application. They're flying people from the UK to Rwanda that's a crisis, right? And so the securitization of borders where France is sending troops to kind of the North Sahel, basically shooting everyone that they don't feel like that they're worried that might get to Libya and Hill. That's a crisis. So the fear is that when we don't control the process as we should, we're going to be we're paying a price in our the norms that we hold cherish. I mean, you cannot understand Brexit without thinking about the response to migration. You can't understand the rise of Trump. You can't understand Orban. I mean, these are all responses to not to a real crisis in terms of people, but to how this played out. And I think there's there's better ways to manage movement of people. I think we're failing. I mean, the fact that, again, going back to some of the numbers of the fact that only less than 1 or 2% of refugee stock have access to what we call durable solution tells us a lot about why we are it's a man-made crisis.
Did you want to add something? I have another question for you, Nicholas. But why don't you add?
The same one, same question. So I think the question that, burden sharing seems important, yes, but there are funds to cover refugee costs in Europe. And I think what's implied in the question is that economic competition and the material costs of population movements drive hostility towards newcomers. And that is a common assumption that people make, that economic competition drive hostility towards immigrants or refugees. And interestingly, in our discipline in political science, that hypothesis has not received a lot of support, empirical support, right? So for example, our colleague Daniel Hopkins has a very nice paper with data from the United States where he surveys the same people over time, and he sees the impact, he measures the impact of economic shocks on hostility towards immigrants. And he finds that hostility doesn't come from the people who compete more directly with immigrants and refugees because of the sectors that they work in. Rather, it comes from the middle class and people who are usually shielded from that competition, right? And this is a result that people have found in other countries as well. And I think also that economic, at least for the European context, economic causes of hostility towards immigration are actually less important than cultural factors. And if cultural factors are more important, then burden sharing is not really the answer here.
I'm going to ask a question that I've gotten through online, but I want to at some point, Nicholas, return to your question about if it's not economic factors and is more cultural, how does one actually have an honest discussion in different countries about cultural differences in a way that's productive and that is not immediately perceived as creating hierarchies, creating divisions? But let's pause on that but I do think it's obviously very important. And obviously, even within Africa, there are sub-Saharan Africa, enormous cultural and ethnic differences, like great diversity. But we're going to pause on that. And I'm going to ask you something from our audience. And again, I'm going to urge our online audience to just mesmerized with the discussion to ask a question at the mic. So I didn't plant this question. So the panelists have not mentioned the race factor, which may have been subsumed under different culture. Race is not culture, which can be an obstacle to integration. I see refugees are seen as the other and the politicization of the other. What is the view of the panelists on this aspect of the quote unquote race factor?
Well, race matters less in countries outside of the US. I think people are surprised by this, but in experiments that we ran in Germany, for example, religion is the main factor that drives opposition towards newcomers, not race. I mean, it's not that Germans are completely open to racial difference. But if you ask them, for example, whom would you like to have as a neighbor or as a friend or as a colleague or something like this, and you give them in an experimental setting a bunch of different attributes that people have, racial attributes, religious attributes, language, professional attributes, and so forth, they will lump all foreigners together and they will prefer them less than they would other Germans. But the one distinguishing feature that they really care about is religious difference, right? And they're much more hostile to Muslims. They don't really care if it's Black Muslims or non-Black Muslims, for example, right? So, and I've seen this in other countries as well. So I think it's a country-specific, it's an empirical question, I think, and it's probably country-specific how much race matters. It's come in public discussion a lot now because people think that Ukrainians are being treated better because they're white, but they're also Christian. And it's also the case that most of them are in Poland, and the Polish people don't like the Russians, and they feel like they're also threatened by them. So all of these factors confound the effect of racial similarity, for example. So it's hard to say, what moves the needle here.
We'll go to Elizabeth and then Guy.
I think, I mean, I think it's hard. The case in Cyprus is very new because the arrival of, again, I know I don't have the data like my colleagues from who've done their research, but I know from my instinct and from our experience. So on the ground, you have cases in places like Cyprus where for the first time, the face of the migrant has changed dramatically in the last 4 to 5 years. It used to be, sort of someone from the Middle East, often a mother with a headscarf and children. And now more and more, the migrant flows that are leading people to Cyprus in particular are from Africa. And race is something different. This is, it's visible. And I think, but it's very difficult to kind of, I agree with Nicholas in that it's, I think, very context specific. And I think it's hard to disassociate. Again, when you look at and otherwise, the headlines tell you that there is a war in Syria. The headlines very often don't tell you that there's a conflict in Cameroon, or that there's a political turmoil in Nigeria that sets people on this long path. And so people just don't, it's partly ignorance, partly race, partly something different, and partly age. I mean, that's the other thing that I think that generally it's easier to maybe get sympathy for an older person or a mother, someone who's obviously a mother, than it is for a 25-year-old man. So
yeah,
we'll go to Guy, and then we'll go to our first in the audience question.
Just so really, really briefly, our research in Africa corresponds to what Nicolas said, that it's like a lot more about religion than about race. I mean, we saw it in the response. I mean, there's many examples. The response of Ugandan to South Sudanese was very different from Somalis. They will oppose the Somalis refugees, but they were very hospitable to South Sudanese. But we see it also not just like in one case study, like across the continent. governments are more likely to liberalize their asylum policies and refugee policies when they share an ethnic affinity with people that are being persecuted in the neighboring countries and are escaping persecution. Not when so this is about this affinity in a way that they won't be more hospitable to people in the same continent that share the same race, but come from a different like ethnic background or different religion. So these are all like race, ethnicity. I mean, these are all like these are social constructions, right? And it's easy to mobilize on the basis of these things. And at least from what what our research suggests is exactly along the line that like race matters much less than religion.
Yes, if you could identify yourself in terms of your Penn affiliation, if you want to, like what school, what year?
Yeah, my name is Aisha. I'm a senior at Penn. I'm studying BEP in Wharton and poli-sci in the college. My question was just like a little general. I know you mentioned that economy or economic shocks necessarily aren't what drive resentment towards migration, but I feel like they're pretty connected. The economy and cultural differences or religious differences kind of go hand in hand. And this is like an indirect kind of relation to migration. But when you're looking at France's ban on hijabs, for example, it's rooted in this idea that like the economy, if people have people who look like them, then there's increased productivity in the workplace. And so I feel like that I see that idea can be translated over into the migration sense or when you have migrants coming in. And so I guess like, how do you overcome these biases, if not by burden sharing? And then just like a side question as well, you said like integration in Africa has been like more successful, or is that something that you've seen in your work? And so I'm curious, is that because it's more of a diverse community in terms of like the groups that are present there, or would you say that is it linked to the idea that these groups have been subject to like discrimination or prejudice in the past?
Who'd like to take that on? That was a multifaceted question. Nicholas?
Yeah, so very briefly, I did not say that economic shocks don't cause hostility towards immigrants. They do actually, but it is not the people most directly affected individually by economic competition with migrants or refugees who are more hostile. The effect of economic factors is what political scientists working on these topics call sociotropic. So I perceive that my nation is in economic distress. I see immigrants using resources that I think are scarce, and therefore I become hostile to them, even if I am not directly in competition, right? But there is a connection between economic shocks, recessions, and joblessness, and things of that sort, and hostility towards migrants. On your second question on how do you overcome the biases, that's like a huge question. There are like thousands of papers on how do you overcome prejudice. And interestingly, it's extremely hard to overcome biases and prejudice, probably cannot be done completely, right? So except by deep structural policy changes that expose people to different cultural backgrounds and people who are different from them, and cultivate basically tolerance, at a deep level, but also burden sharing, like you said, is probably it's common sense to think that it would help, right? It certainly does not help to have people who are resentful of others, right? Even if resolving that resentment via burden sharing is probably not enough to reduce prejudice.
Guy.
Thanks for this great question. I'll just say something about the second question. So just to be clear, I didn't say that like all integration of refugees across Africa is seamless. There's plenty of conflict to go about. Just see how the Burundis are treated in Tanzania, how Zimbabweans are treated in South Africa. So, just to be clear, the issue for me is less about some innate kind of something about like Africa, and more about like how resource allocation policies take place. And at least our research suggests that when resources that arrive to the country in order to help with hosting refugees, with the burden of, because there is a burden of hosting refugees, when those resources are allocated in a way that also benefit the local population, you end up with a different world in which the local population sees only like new schools being built in a refugee camp and refugees getting like cash transfers from UNHCR, and then it, creates a lot of resentment, or some policies of like NGOs that we only going to hire like now refugees, in order to kind of help them in the integration. That just creates, massive resentment. So the point that I'm making is quite simple. The way we allocate resources, the way we manage our policies can go a long way in mitigating some of the tensions. But I will also, concur with Nicholas. It's really, 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 really hard because by human nature, we're parochial. We care more about our kin and kith.
I would just
Elizabeth?
add one in my point, my insight comes from anecdotal sort of experience, is that really I think a job is what changes everything. The dynamic when someone works, whether their motivation was, persecution and they're a refugee recognized, or whether they're an economic migrant, once they enter the job market, it seems to overcome a little bit of what I think dovetails with what the observations that come from the research, that there's a productivity, that people see something different. And that is a productive interaction, both socially, kind of it lends itself to a more positive integration prospect.
So I have a question of my own that I want you all to think about while I ask you a question from the iPad, i.e. the people who are online, and I'm going to then invite other people to go to the microphone. So it strikes me a little bit as we sit here that, so Guy, you've pointed out that in terms of durable solutions, even by the measurements that UNHCR has come up with and that we presume the global community agrees with, we're failing, right? If less than 1% of people have access to kind of these three areas, if those are your measurements, we're failing. And Nicholas, you pointed out that in the German case, religion seemed to have really mattered. And so what strikes me is that I feel like we also want like a one approach to dealing with the refugee crisis rather than a differentiated approach that's based on standards, whether it's regard to services and school and work, et cetera. But that if we could figure out per country, what are the series of things that matter most, right? So in the Germany case, it might be religion. In France, in Europe, it might be something else. In Spain, it might be, I don't know, it might be three things. And so I do want you all to think about whether or not we need to actually begin to have a far more sophisticated and empirically informed approach to countries' response to refugees. Nicholas said earlier that there wasn't a lot of empirical evidence that supported the issue of, I might be misstating this, but resource allocation being the main kind of problem with refugee integration. And so what I'm just trying to figure out is whether we need to be just more sophisticated per country and per refugee crisis rather than looking at it as kind of an undifferentiated whole. And so while you think about that, there is a question online that says, that asks, what role does gender play in how refugees are received and integrated? Any takers?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, I'm not sure. Again, to me, gender informs a lot of what's happening, not just in terms of perception, but in terms of response. I think it's, again, women who are on the move are suffering much more. I mean, again, it opens up a lot of questions. I'm not sure what direction to take it in. I would comment that, for example, I think it was Médecins Sans Frontières recently said that no woman can undertake a journey now of any migration or fleeing without contraception, because it is likely impossible that she will get to her destination without having to face some sort of sexual exploitation. And I'm sure that that's not just limited to women.
Well, and I think the question is in part like, are female refugees somehow perceived differently and received differently and integrated differently than their host countries? And Nicholas, you look like you were prepared to say something, and then Guy.
I mean, it's probably a deeper question and a broader question on this, but at the most superficial level, there is clear evidence that women are accepted much more easily than men, especially much young men. So like the toughest situation is if you're male, single, and young, basically, from a Muslim country. That's not good, basically, particularly in Europe. So people have found experimentally, actually, that integration or asylum applications will be accepted much more easily for women. But can I say something about your question, or is that for later?
Let's see if Guy wants to respond to the gender question, and then you can respond to my question.
One thing we haven't discussed is, refugee is a status, right? Like it's a legal status, and we haven't talked about the kind of the questions around like how we classify people as migrant, which means like an economic migrant versus like refugee, right? The gender kind of enters that in the sense that for most Europeans, and that's also the case here in the United States, when they see a male, young, single, they assume that that's definitely an economic migrant and not like a, whereas when you see, that's the kind of the assumption, it's not that's necessarily right. And when we see like women and kids, there's kind of a greater kind of, the perception is that they are, escaping kind of violence, and this is not just about like economic opportunity, and so it feeds into like people's psychic about like deservedness, which is a very important kind of issue to think about like the perception of like the public. I think it's mostly perceptions of the public. Most of them are wrong, but I think that's one place where like gender enters in kind of the deservedness discourse and perception. But we can have a whole event only about like the definition of what's a migrant and what's a refugee and the subjectivity that goes into that.
Nicholas?
On your question?
On my question.
So it's a good question. And I think that the answer is going to be unpleasant. You said, wouldn't it be nice if we knew country by country, basically, what makes a difference?
Wouldn't it be useful and effective?
Yeah, it would be great. It would be extremely hard to collect that data or publish it, basically. If you're an academic, you're concerned about that as well. And different things will matter in different countries. But presumably, that would have a positive impact on policy. But like, you can just take one country, take Germany, where we did our work, and you can consider what are some policy interventions that can help reduce distance created by the attribute or the difference that people care most about, which is religious difference, right? So we did some experiments, field experiments in Germany across cities, like in 30 different cities over 2 years with thousands of people. And we found that when you reduce cultural distance with respect to one subgroup, let's say when you make German women think that they're less distant from Muslim women, German Christian women, that actually can reduce the bias that they feel towards those women. But the same interventions have no effect on German men, right? So you said, if we knew the attribute that causes the largest social distance between native population and immigrants, that might help design good policies, and it would. But the problem is that there's probably not a single policy intervention that can reduce distance across all subgroups of the native population and the immigrant group, right? Because people care about different things within a particular nation.
Thank you. Either Guy or Elizabeth. We have about a minute left. Is it on?
Yeah, I think now it's on. Just something very briefly. So there's a little bit of good news and bad news. The good news that we haven't spoken about is the fact that if we look at quite a bit of European and countries and the United States, when we look at attitudes towards migrants and migration policy, we actually see a secular increase in acceptance, right? Like the average actually is increasing. That's kind of a good news. And we don't talk a lot about it, but we're actually seeing it, including in the United States. The bad news is that this like small secular increase in acceptance hides a big variation in what we're seeing is polarization of the attitudes, where increasingly urban. In the case of the United States, it's also like liberal, and we call him Democrats here. Increasingly quite a bit the support to hosting refugees and to migrants, where some parts of the country are reducing quite dramatically. Why is that like a bad news? It's bad news because when the issue becomes polarizing, when the issue becomes like politically salient, it becomes very difficult to move people or opinions. We've got a lot of research suggests that even you provide people with facts about the fact that migrants within 10 years of arriving in the United States, not only they're not like a burden on the welfare state, they're net positive to the budget. You give people the information, it kind of doesn't matter, right? And trying to change attitudes is increasingly difficult when an issue is politically salient. So the good news, on average, we're getting better. The bad news is it's really, really difficult to move the needle for those that the starting point is quite negative.
So we're going to begin to wrap up, and I'm going to do two things. So Guy, you've kind of started with good news, bad news, and maybe we will wrap up with both Elizabeth giving us in her words, kind of both the good news and the bad news. And Nicholas, either based on your book or any other observations, what you think the good news and the bad news might be about future considerations related to migrants in Europe in particular, but kind of more generally. Elizabeth.
Well, yeah, I guess I was going to try and answer your question. It would be great to know more about all of the all of the idiosyncrasies and find the silver bullet that would work in every case. I'm just not sure we have the luxury of time, because there's none of this. Again, there's for every one of the 100 million that are displaced, there's a face, and they have needs. And oftentimes this is the challenge, and it's the challenge in Africa just as it is in Europe right now, to deal with today's needs versus tomorrow's needs versus next week's needs. So, but there are resources. I mean, it's not hopeless. I think we just have to get better at it. And that's part of that is research, and part of that is practice.
The final word before we wrap up.
So I guess to the extent that there's good news from our work, it would be that what I said earlier, which is that ethnic attributes or ethnic differences, religious differences, racial differences can be overcome, right? So it does not, being different at a superficial level doesn't necessarily imply conflict, right? So that's good. But overcoming them means that everybody has to converge on a common set of ideas and norms, and that's difficult to achieve. In particular, when social change happens fast, as it did during the European refugee crisis of 2015, like 1.5 million people coming into Germany, 800,000 people going into the island of Lesbos in Greece with a population of like 100,000 people, right? That's insane, okay? George Cassinis, Elizabeth's husband, who's sitting down there, was telling me that the real issue is climate refugees, of whom there's going to be 150 million projected by the World Bank in the near future. Where are all these people going to go, and how will the cultural differences that these population movements generate be accommodated? Okay, so it's hard to see good news in that picture, I'm afraid.
So Guy, you do get the last word, and then I'm going to wrap up, but it sounded like you wanted to say something, or it looked like.
No, I mean, I have so much to say, but I also want to be mindful of the time. So I just want to thank you again.
Seconds.
No, I mean, I think I agree. I mean, I think the place that I want to leave you with like two kind of thoughts. The first one is that when we look at a stock of refugees in the world, they're really concentrated from like 6, 7 sending countries. Like, it's not that we have like all countries of the world that's kind of equal. So these are like, there's like these moments in which you suddenly have like, you know, a depopulation of Syria, depopulation of Venezuela. That also means that like, it's not necessarily that we need to solve the kind of like address the problem everywhere in the world at the same time. We can concentrate resources. And if we can concentrate them in a smart way, I think we might be, there's some leeway that we can get. So that's kind of one thought that I wanted to leave you. I had another one, but I can't remember. So if I'll remember in a second.
Okay, well then you'll let us know. And so I want to wrap up by saying you all have been a terrific audience in terms of really focusing and paying attention. And I'm grateful that you allowed us to stay a couple of extra minutes. Part of what I'm taking away from this discussion is that your final point about concentrating resources to deal with the problem seems right, but I like the question.
I do. Yeah,
okay,
sorry.
okay,
I did remember. Another thing that I want you to take away is that research suggests that the concerns that people have with refugees and migrants is more about flow rather than stock. Okay, so people have responded to what, like Nicolas said, like to 800,000 people coming to Lesbos in a very small period, or to like the 3 million. But people are less concerned about the number of refugees or number of migrants. It's more about what they perceive the flow, because that is very scary. And that's why we have these like images of like wave. People call it like, I don't like the term wave because that's a tsunami. That's scary, right? So so to the extent that we might, you know, to the extent that we won't have big waves in the near future, maybe there's some, you know, there's accommodation that happens over time because people, as I said, don't worry so much about stock. If the projections that Nicolas was talking about of climate refugees will realize themselves, then I think it's a different ballgame.
Great. And so my second point was only going to be that it strikes me that public policy, the global public policy in the UNHCR and others aren't sufficiently using empirical evidence to inform UN strategy. And that just strikes me as astonishing, actually, that there is evidence that suggests X, like that the 3 pillars that related to durable solutions aren't being met in any meaningful way, or that economic concerns might not be the lead for people in some country, really matters when we're looking at limited resources in some ways and policies that have to address people's immediate needs. But on that note, I want to give our panelists a round of applause. And I want to let you know that there's a book talk coming up next Tuesday for noon in Philadelphia, and it'll be online, that features Scott Moore, who has a new book out, or Penn Scott Moore, who has a new book out that's called China's Next Act. And it examines how sustainability and technology are reshaping China's rise and the world's future. So you should go online and sign up for that. As you all know, you can find a recording of this on YouTube, maybe in a day or two. You should follow Perry World House on all social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And it's been a pleasure as always. And there's a grab and go snack for everyone who's in the room. Thank you again.